Good evening, I'm Yossi Bilo, and on behalf of Alisa and all of us in the gallery, I'm delighted to welcome you to a panel discussion of Angela Dufresne paintings.
Unknown caller.
We are very excited to show Angela's premiere exhibition in the gallery with all of you at home. We have a brilliant panel with us tonight, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. The event tonight will be a discussion of selected paintings in Angela's astonishing exhibition involved in short shots. We've set aside about 20 minutes at the end to take questions and answers from the audience, so we encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen.
And tonight's panel is moderated by Melissa Ragona. Melissa is an associate professor of critical theory and art history at Carnegie Mellon University. She's a curator, critic, lecturer, and author, and her forthcoming book is The Warhol Tapes Beyond Ready-Made Sounds. And with that, I ask our host for this evening, Melissa Ragona, to take it away. Enjoy, everyone.
Okay. Thank you so much, Yossi and Alisa. Before we launch into our, there she is, Angela Dufresne discussion with our stellar guests today, Malin Blake and Charles Bernstein. I'm going to introduce them shortly. I just want to, once again, extend a really big thanks to Yossi and his incredible staff, which includes Matthew, Alisa, Catherine, Cami, and we just couldn't have gotten this all together without you. So thanks so much for putting this all together. And I really want to thank Angela Dufresne, who you see before you in front of her incredible painting, whose long and short shots, right? This whole body of recent painting has inspired this discussion. And I just want to talk kind of directly to you, Angela. Your critically complex work has just engaged so many of us here today and in the past. And your rigorous daring practice. I did write this, but I'm bouncing off it, right? Because I want to get it right. And your breathless output just continues to impress and impassion me and many of us who are your friends and colleagues. And I want to quote this really lovely New York Times highlight on Angie just yesterday, I believe, by Jillian Steinhauer. And she says, Dufresne's work has a kind of spectral quality. Neither dreams or nightmares, the work seems closer to hallucinations, the teeming, transgressive imaginings of a liberated hand and mind, unquote. And I want to add, equals the entire body. For I have seen you at work in your studio, your whole body, not just your hands, immersed in the kind of palette which is behind me. I secretly photographed in your studio about a year ago, this incredible palette in my virtual background today that is attuned to color, its vibration, its threat, its promise to bring us into unpredictable territories, which this current show that's so fearless also certainly does. I also called your mind quixotic because it runs through not only multiple experiences at once social, political, autobiographical, but multiple references. Today, we will only mention a few, but you sample riffs and you translate with lightning speed into your own work. Sources as varied as Albert Bierstadt, John Constable, Jean-Francois Millet, Thomas Cole, Giovanni Tiepolo, Grant Wood, Reginald Marsh, Jean-Luc Godard, Terrence Malick, Terrence Davies, David Swift, Robert Bresson, and especially important here today, Miklos Giancho, Jean Cassavetes, Dolly Parton, Lord Byron, and Gina Rowlands. So our panelists, besides the great painter Dufresne, I want to do a quick one because there's just so many accolades in each of their biographies. Dufresne, who can count a Guggenheim, a National Academy of Arts and Letters, and a Jerome Foundation Fellowship, among many, many others. And read their extended bios, because I'm just not going to get to all of this. But I want to say I've been really lucky to have as a long friend and intellectual colleague, the great poet and critic Charles Bernstein, who you see with that fabulous hat in front of Angie's painting, whose inventive body of work from his early days as a co-founder of Language Poetry, that's a contested term, of course, / writing, to his more recent brilliant work on sound. Look at his book, Close Listening, fab book, as well as his work on translation. Look at his most recent volume, Attack of the Difficult Poems, also great titles, as well as numerous works that simply make language new to us again and again and again and again and again. Fabulous. Be sure to pick up his forthcoming books. There's so much to say. Double Talking, the Homophonic Sublime, and also forthcoming Topsy Turvy. He's been graced with many awards, including also, all three here, Guggenheim's, man, and NEA, and most recently, the Bollingen Prize for American Poetry, the premier American Prize for Lifetime Achievement, really well deserved. I really consider him one of the most important living poets today. And he's also very steeped in art and painting. He's collaborated with visual artists Susan B., Mimi Gross, Amy Silman, Francie Shaw, and Richard Tuttle, and hopefully in the future, Angie Dufresne. And finally, our distinguished panelist, who I adore, Nayland Blake. I've only really met him recently, like at a New Year's Day party. But I've been a longtime fan of his adventurous, brave work that ranges across sculpture, performance, video, installation, drawing, painting, writing, curating, and many other media. He's equally decorated with many, many honors. It sounds like you're a soldier, which you are. You're an art soldier, man. Having been featured in the Whitney Biennial, the Venice Biennale, and many other exhibitions, both nationally and internationally, especially for this vast body of work. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, and his work is collected by San Francisco Museum of Art, the Whitney, the Walker Arts Center, and many other prestigious collections. His recent show that originated at the ICA in LA, called No Wrong Holes, which has gotten rave reviews, is a retrospective of his work, the last 30 years of Nayland Blake. And then it moved over to the MIT list, and it just closed, right? February 14th, I think, right? That weird commercial holiday of love. Okay, those are our panelists. So I want to just launch into this because we have a tight schedule. We want to try to end by 7 with us. And everyone, we will be noting all your questions. So type away in the where you can to ask us questions, and we're going to do a Q&A after all of this. And I want to also thank the incredible Yossi staff. Just really couldn't do it without you. All right. How come we're not on the golden showers of love painting? I guess I missed that. We're now on the examination. Oh, we are on the golden showers. Oh my God.
Yeah,
I am so high from not eating too much today and shoveling snow. There's the golden showers of love painting. Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. I know it well and love it so much. We want to start out, and Nayland and I will take the lead on this, but Charles, feel free to jump in, of course. If you see at the top of the painting, there's a tribute to Sam Delaney. It's like Sam Delaney. And in particular, it's dedicated to this essay and really inspired by, really, not dedicated, but The Rhetoric of Sex, the Discourse of Desire from 1992. Really important paradigm shifting, pre-Judith Butler in a way, essay. And what, Angie, I really want to push you on this, right? Because a really big pulsing theme, pulsing, in Dufresne's work is the libidinal, to use an old-fashioned term, sex, to just use a raw term, eroticism, right? All sorts of wonderfully wild situations. But this one in particular is really looking at the kind of theater of power that's around both in culture, both in sex, and what Delaney really targets in this essay. And I just want to read one little quote because it's about, he's trying to make this distinction between interpretation and perception. And he says the problem, right, with kind of the major discourses, the kind of more, what's the word, authoritative discourses in culture around gender and sexuality and sex, is that these rules kind of take over, right? And interpretation takes over right away. So in the discussion, quote from him, of discourse, a concept eventually must arise. It seems to be part of the modern discourse of discourse itself. It is given by the phrase, interpretation precedes perception. To understand it, we might start with an alternative narrative as to how humans perceive things. So I want you to bounce off of that, Angie, and because I know this essay was really central to several of your paintings, not just this one, but especially this one, Golden Showers of Love.
Well, there's a part in the essay where he talks about his daughter sort of, I mean, I don't want to use too much religious language in this, but kind of transcends that discursive notion of her own body where, you know, she's sort of automatically supposed to lose the pissing conversation that competition that she has in Central Park with other 3 and 4-year-olds. And she sort of, through this imagination that is unpolluted by a discursive notion of what it means to be female, is able to aim her urine and beat the boys. And as a queer person, and the boys are just like, oh, whatever, I have this thing and it should point farther. And there's that interpretation before the observation of like what your capacities are. And a queer capacity would be, which I think is the notion of his kind of breakdown of discourse, is that a queer notion of discourse, or rather it's laminated on top of what is the expected discourse, has other portals in which to articulate and embody. And those things are as cued into what can be imagined as what can be observed. So the phenomenology of being able to contort your body to do something that socially assumed notions do not imagine is a queer notion of affect and of invention. And to a certain extent, like, so that I was really drawn to that. I mean, I was also like, the original image of this was drawn in a drawing night party thing with Jeff Chadsey, Mala Iqbal, Lizzie Bonaventura, and I had been riffing on this Poussin print where there were floating putti, and the kind of the whole arsenal of Jesus and his crew. Not that this is really a religious painting by any means. And I just jokingly said, like, God, are these kids gonna shit on these adults? And my friend Jeff Chadsey said, who Nayland knows from a million years ago, back in the San Francisco days, said, they're peeing. And I had made multiple paintings of piss, and I had been thinking about that essay, and it all sort of converged in what became the structure of the narrative condition in this. I could go on, but I mean, seriously, I would love to hear from these amazing minds as well.
Yeah, Nayland, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this kind of will lead off from that. And first of all, I have to say, Angela, thanks for pointing me in the direction of this essay, which I had not read.
Oh my God.
I know. I'm such a Delaney head, and like Dahlgren was the turning point for me as like a young science fiction fan in the 70s. But there's something that I sort of highlighted in here, and where Delaney's sort of talking about like the way that sex has come to be recuperated into a kind of discourse in the early 90s when the essay is written. He says, sex has become the medium through which someone declares a form of the social to be natural law, rather than considering sex itself as simply another social form. At this point, we should be able to recognize the same discursive structure, the same misapplied logic in them all. He's talking about these ideas that there are sort of transcendental forms, archetypes, and how this is a sort of misapplied wishful thinking. And I think the thing that seems powerful to me in this painting and in so much of your work, first of all, I was like, it totally drew me up short, and I was like, how is it that I can never make like a drawing that has more than a single person in it? like there's so many people. It's like, how do you even do that? But also I think the thing that's powerful about it is the extent to which it is unnameable. That when we try to, like, it's great seeing this activity like right after Mardi Gras, you know, and feeling like, okay, wait, is this Bourbon Street? But even then, there's a kind of slippage in the way in which this scene is not reducible to a named activity, which is exactly, I think, the thing that that Delaney is trying to talk about in terms of avoiding discourse as a kind of naturalization and flattening. And so that made me think about, like, okay, how do these things get, how do these paintings emerge for you? I was going to say, like, how do you build these paintings? But that's really like a sculptor's thing. But I think that there's this this welcoming kind of orgiastic, slippage of the name in these paintings that's so exciting to me. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about, like, how do they emerge in the studio? How does this collection of things happen for you?
Well, it did definitely. That's amazing. Thank you. It did definitely happen through, like a series of laminated or unlaminated would be a more accurate way of describing it, processes. And some of them are social. So my drawing practice really blew up when, like what we did when we were teaching it at the Vermont Studio Center, and we had that like beer and we just sat across from each other and drew for like 2 hours, which was such a lovely thing. I started hosting these dinner parties because I'm a lunatic in the kitchen. I just love cooking, and friends would just come through the house and we would just all draw, and we would draw on each other's drawings. And to a certain extent, that sense of accumulation became something that was really, and layering, that was really like driving the way that I could make the paintings as social as I wanted them to be. And so to a certain extent, like that they're not contained in ways that a narrative would be. They're sort of piles of micro events that don't correlate. And I sort of like thought of that as like, that's the way our individualness, which I'm, highly skeptical about, if not revolted by, like the American capitalist notion of the individual, which I'm sure we all agree. But anyway, this thing of like all of these forces that come into play to make each other, and to a certain extent engineer the social spaces that they navigate and metabolize simultaneously in this highly porous, horrific act of like living, and God forbid, actually trying to enact or ask for desire. I love that part in the Delaney text where he keeps telling those straight dudes to be like, ask her if tell her you like her and ask her if she likes you, right? And that notion of being able to ask for somebody else's input and be porous and to hear them. And then specifically he talks about gender and that, but I think just in general, it's not something that Americans that are encapsulating the individualist ideology do. So that process is very much like call and response, is like how the drawings came about, and it's how the original drawing happened here. And then in terms of thinking about the crowds, which is, there are two kind of types of paintings in the show. There are the crowd scenes, and then there are the headshots. So that's kind of like the crowds or the long shots in my mind. I mean, anybody can inverse that if they feel compelled. And the heads are sort of the close-up. It's this idea of like where we are produced and how we are completely a gaseous entity that's being formed and forming everyone else socially around us. And so I just got really interested in the crowd as that, like not a Celine-based crowd or not a mob at the fucking Capitol, but a crowd that is polymorphic, and how that kind of notion of exchange creates a possibility for like this person to be freaked out and turned on at the same time as they're trying to aspire to whatever the hell it is. And again, I don't know exactly what is the interiority of every one of these characters. Although this is William E. Jones right there. Anyway.
Okay, can we move to the examination and keep this discussion going? Because there's a similar crowd kind of queer utopian dream going on in the examination, right? Which is totally inspired by the gay novelist John Horn Burns, as well as a kind of a rethinking of brutalist architecture. You're constantly using architecture as this background. So I want you to talk about how, in some ways, because it's also related to the way you do covers. So it's deeply related to translation, which is the question I want to move into with Charles. So why don't you, Charles, do you want to address that first so that we can get, because we're running a little short already. That would be great. Just bounce off of what I said.
Can you hear me? Is my microphone
Yes!
on? Wow.
Excellent.
First of all, it's great to be here with you in the gallery. And I love seeing you in the gallery, which becomes part of the visual image of the painting. And this is sort of what I'm interested in, is can be illustrated by the relation of your figure in relation to your paintings. I want to emphasize, though, that the reproduction of your work, like many artists, although not every artist, really is a very different experience than seeing it live and in the flesh. And by the way, Angie, you should not be touching the paintings. I don't know. It really is. I know there's no guard there, but I really don't think that's appropriate.
Too late, Charles.
You know, one of the questions I'm going to go in a different direction on the Chip Delaney, Samuel R. Delaney, but one of the questions that I asked him in the close listening interview I did with him is a good way to sort of make the segue. And he did not really exactly get what I was saying. He didn't respond the way I might have thought, but I'm going to repeat it to you. I contrasted in his work fantasy and imagination, which is the famous term from Coleridge. And I think it relates to other interests you have in the way in which reason and rationality is thought of in the Western tradition since the Enlightenment. So imagination is the big, heavy, hegemonic, serious, deep thing. And fancy or fantasy is trivialized. It's feminized, for one thing. It's like angels or fairies or things that seem less totalized. So obviously, you would be a painter of fantasy, and fancy writ as imagination, as many artists that I like are. And I would say that's true of Delaney too. So I want to talk about what that means in paintings like yours, maybe in a little bit more formal terms, because I think that the way in which you're talking about the politics of the work actually has a kind of allegorical relationship to the form in your paintings. And particularly, I'm interested in the relation of, very, very old time terms like figure and ground and framing. For one thing, you have multiple frames in your work that are incommensurable. And this incommensurability relates to my patron saint, the same last name as our friend here, Blake, the other Blake, William Blake. So you have multiple incommensurable frames. I'm interested in how you think about this. Incommensurability is a kind of, I didn't look today, but last week it was going for $39.95. It's a little bit an expensive word, but not that expensive. It means things that can't be reconciled on one plane. You can't see it as a unitary thing. Now, the politics of that, you said, we're not individual people in a bubble. It's not just one thing, one perspective. There's a long history in respect to this around perspective, where perspective would have a single point of view. You'd see it and you'd see the whole thing. You seem to shatter that. And I wonder how you think about that issue of multiple conflicting frames, fancy versus imagination, and the breaking of perspective to allow multiple perspectives that can't be in the same place in a way, that can't exist exactly on the same plane, but that do exist within the democratic social space of your painting.
Wow, that's so amazing. I mean, well, part of that is I feel like I got to try to tie that back into what Nayland said about sculpting these things. I definitely don't think of myself as a sculptor, and I don't even see in three-dimensional space. So, but let's not get started in that. I think of myself as an engineer of this painting, in the sense it's like I'm, the architecture, this brutalist architecture, which is the Galleria Marimotti in Emilio Romano. But that doesn't really matter. It's a brutalist building that was built to call attention to what bodies were doing and to sort of impose the kind of labor onto the bodies as though there was no other purpose for them. And anyways, so in terms of all of these kind of incommensurable things, there's the way there is the way that the narrative, the way that the exchanges between bodies is incommensurable with the whole, and yet in a sense that this moment is incommensurable with this moment, in the sense that there is no way of building a schematic or a theme or a story out of it. But then there's also the fact that the way that they are, the way that they're transposed or like layered, almost woven, like calligraphically over the ground, which contradicts them, but also sometimes creates a lighting condition that makes an atmospheric quality that is a phantom atmospheric quality, but it does have luminosity. To me, I'm really glad to hear you say that so that it rings the right register of naturalism, and I mean to pervert that kind of, whether it's enlightenment or to a certain extent modern notion of the natural, which is of course insane and should be challenged in every one of its orifices. In a sense, all of those holes are wrong that we went down to try to figure out how to understand the world. That this natural, that there's the right amount of naturalism, so that the jarring dislocation of these what I would think of as montaged moments, not in a film reel, but montaged like the way Velázquez would do it, or the way Paul Cadmus would do it, or Ensor would montage a space. It's a fictional space. But I'm very interested, and I think this is why I love Delaney so much, but I think this is why I love many writers so much, that there is this, they're grounded in the fiction, are these flashes of the naturalism that has ordered our world, and that we can either completely, tell that to eradicate that, or we can bump up against it. And I think, given the demographics and the culture that I come from, I'm more interested in butting up against it and sort of throwing this kind of naturalism into an ephemeral state, a phantom state of instability, if that makes sense.
It all makes sense. And of course, I think of phantasmagorias is another way to think about what you're doing, because as in this painting, the images are popping up. There is perhaps a hallucinogenic quality. One thing that I would say just differently, and it's just because of the in a way, a technical issue of how you describe things. I don't see the work as involved with radical juxtaposition as much as a kind of melting and merging. And because the figures emerge from the depths of the paint and are dissolved back into it. And so the overlay is what's so powerful. I think of, Lucy Lepard's famous book called Overlay, but overlay seems an interesting way. You said laminated in your first remarks, and that was not a word that I had thought of before, but it's a wonderful word for what I'm talking about. Lamination, layer, overlay, and the fluidity of melting, which reverses or oscillates between the figure and the ground. So you can't see what is the figure and what is the ground. It depends on what you're looking at. So I will stop there and let you.
I mean, it's that interdependency too that I want the works to speak to, that there's the forces of the architecture, the forces of the objects, the prosthesis things that happen in the space that the figures gain or lose agency to, that they're all in this exquisite kind of haptically choreographed state of making and becoming and relying and to a certain extent pushing each other beyond the bounds of what they are.
I want to just jump in here, and I want Charles to continue this idea. I want to move now to the front gallery, to the opera of the Forlorn. just to keep us on schedule. And
Yes, and of course, what I'm talking about is very much in that painting as well.
Yes. And I want to say, Charles, one thing I was thinking of, because I want to get to that at the end, is that besides melting and notions of overlay, of course, that's also, I think, why Angela's attracted to cinema and film, the notion of with technology, how you can superimpose. So the whole notion of superimposition, cross-cutting, all these things that she borrows from.
And yet it would be more like, of course, John Cassavetes, who I love, and all the rest, but the kind of film we'd be talking about would be more in the kind of brackage line than a conventional narrative film, not because of the concepts or the ideas, but because within the single frame, you have the overlay taking place. And that's different than in film. In fact, it's only in the so-called avant-garde or independent film that you would have this kind of merging or melting of images. Although it's an interesting reverse relationship where the temporal and the kinetic is put into the single frame of painting. The painting is so powerful because, after all, you seem to look at it all at once, but you can't see these paintings all at once.
Right. Yeah, I argue that the way to kind of view them is the way we can view film or frames of film, by like walking along them and things then pop out, and we can examine close-ups and then kind of step back and also examine that long shot. But I don't want to lose that thread. And the two things I want to just pull out here are, again, I just want to name some references and then go back into a more conceptual way to approach this. But you have so many things happening here. Up in the one corner, you have William Jennings Bryan's critique of the gold standard speech, a reference to that, as well as the whole thing takes place in this architecture that is the Metropolitan Tabernacle, right, around mid to late 1800s, where we have Charles Spurgeon, like this liberal, pragmatic Baptist preacher, right, giving a sermon. And I want you to talk about the child body, also related to kind of this title thing we borrowed from the film, and you have it in another painting, The Parent Trap, which you didn't talk about because you also talk about in terms of golden showers. Okay, and also the film, right, by Jean Chou, right, the red and the white, right? Yeah, up in the left-hand corner. Okay, so there's so much going on. Yeah.
I mean, the Jean Chou, I think, is very important just in terms of thinking about the way a painting is whatever, that a painting can be a montage space, so that in fact they all are, because they're all fundamentally fiction, but it's within a single frame. And I was really blown away by the red and the white, both because of like this moment, which was around the same time, which is why it ended up in here, because it's the same time period. Not when Sturgeon is doing his speeches about whatever, being an abolitionist or something like that, but actually later when William Jennings Bryan is trying to eradicate the gold standard, and which is basically like which was ended, the convention of basic currency on gold ended by Nixon. Apropos, I think that becomes the real globalism moment. But anyway, it's why this thing is gold, by the way. I mean, to a certain extent, it's literally an illustrative color choice, which I just want to be full disclosure and admit that. But at the same time, or it was basically based in the kind of post-World War I conflicts in Russia. The red and the white it was shot in Russia, but is by a director from Czechoslovakia. That's beside the point. Anyway, the scenes in that film do not build a narrative. There is kind of a series of actions that happen that the camera sort of locks in on, and then sort of flaneurs out of, and at some point you kind of get the street. It's like the experience in that film is like walking down the street in New York City. You might run into another friend, and then suddenly your whole day is changed. In the sense of this film, it's very much about the brutality of power and of this really, really intense moment of like the end of imperialism and the sort of beginning of the bifurcated communism capitalism battle, and these people that are trying to outsmart each other and kill each other. It's utterly a horrifying moment. but it is a way in which through these crowded scenes, through these pans that to a certain extent destabilize the way a story would be told in a film. It's not, brackage pouring color all over a frame, but it does kind of destabilize the way narrative functions in film. So I love that film for that reason, and its duration, its strange duration and strange non-linearity to it. And I was really interested in trying to figure out how to do that in a painting. But I also, I'll say one more thing and then I'll shut up. I'm really interested in color sitting on the surface of a painting and having light and luminosity come through the color, like that kind of weird worship of celluloid that happened. I want that light to be ephemeral and fleeting in that way, that I have to be kind of live on stage. There is very little, even though I work on these paintings over a long period of time, there's very little revision. And it's that sense that it's there and it is actual and factual, not in some way revised.
I just wanted to point out in that film, The Red and the White, there's this, because it points back to Charles's point about frames within frames and this incommensurability. The whole film is kind of constructed in that way. And also when there's one scene where so many people are dying at once, but it's almost beautiful. It's this the kind of golden light that's over it, but it's spectral. So it's chilling because it's this aestheticized moment of mass death and spectacle. And I feel like you transpose that in some ways, in this painting, in the light. Anyhow.
Wow, that's amazing.
Sorry, I love it.
I hope so.
I don't know. And Dolly Parton's in here. Why is Dolly Parton in here? Dolly Parton is in this painting, right?
I mean, she's in a lot of paintings, but I mean, I'd be curious to see if Malin had something, maybe. No pressure.
Oh,
Malin,
about Dolly.
Oh God! Well, yeah, or I don't know. Yeah. Maybe.
No, I mean, I'm glad she's in there. She just turned down having a monument built to her in Tennessee with a very tart letter. I guess the thing that I come back to with these is that I less think about them as a kind of filmic transmission, and I'm much more caught by the thing that you brought up earlier, Angela, about them being made out of a kind of sociability. That they depict, that they depict a kind of collectiveness, but also they emerge out of a kind of collective experience. And so I think, I remember that drawing time, and then also you coming to Craft Buddies, and I think that there's a weird way in which, we've seen a kind of resurgence of very kind of monolithic representation in recent painting that is feels like it's all about redressing a kind of social wrong, but often depicts subjects really divorced from any kind of sociability, and also that the making of those works seems armored. Like the thing that's lovely about you making these things in this way is the kind of ebb and flow that comes from an actual social experience. And I think that's, it may be after this particular year that we've had, but I'm super hungry for that. And I think it's also kind of a very rare thing in the way that the art world normally runs itself, that people are allowed to think about themselves as being part of a social group.
Yeah, it's very important to me. A lot of these paintings in the show are really, to a certain extent, as we as we segue into maybe the Jenna, which I know is like next on our whatever itinerary. A lot of these film references come from a very dear friend of mine, Dawn Clemens, who went through the semiotics program with like Todd Haynes at Brown in the early 80s, and was just an absolute encyclopedic and generous and kind of really non-hierarchical thinker. I mean, like she would go watch Any Given Sunday and have a ball, and that is a piece of horror, that movie. And but she would sit and watch Godard 5 times in a row, and it was just, and they all had like equal cultural power to her. And so a lot of these, a lot of the references, a lot of these sources are me using my body, projecting these relationships I have. There's a painting which we won't get distracted, I know, but there's a painting right behind Matthew that he could pan over as we're going back to the back room. He will. That is a prompt from the artist and filmmaker William E. Jones, and I've been working with him in banter, in conversation, making paintings in which he prompts me and sort of not bullies, but playfully bullies me into making. And he's doing it now. He has all kinds of ideas about what I want to do. And to a certain extent, the idea of painting as this hermetically sealed, individualist, again, this individual in a room, finding their, invisible, superpower is like the last thing that I personally want to do as an artist. Like painting is the place that was my social education and my political education, whether it was looking at these Napoleon portraits and laughing and hating them, or otherwise. And so it's a social space for me, even if it is a frame. Yeah. And I like to think about it as a longer history than just the way it's been defined, which is also very exciting. I'm clearly very much a modernist or a modern-ish person, but and steeped in those in the avant-garde. But I'm also really interested in Caravaggio having to paint something from somebody else's script, and then like, how do you weave yourself into the fabric of that social idea that needs to be spoken about for whatever reason?
If I could say something, I mean, that to me is exactly why I think it's Jenna Rollins is such a welcome figure in this, because I think of her as a kind of anti-star, in that the performances are so moment to moment, and her emergence as an actress is so embedded in a kind of sociability scene, but at the same time completely compelling. And I think of like Opening Night as this this film that is like a horror film. It's a film about how somebody actually just makes work. It's a film about like what being scrutinized means. All of that, I think, is just so. She's such a fantastic figure in these terms.
I couldn't agree more.
Before we maybe stay on this one for a second, before we move on to the Gina Rollins, and I know, conscious of the time, I'll say a few things.
We're good.
For one thing, I think that Nayland's point about monolithic representation, and in fact, Angie's point about not wanting to have that single space, I mean, it's something that within poetry, many of us have been advocated, our whole lives in poetry, against a certain idea of the unitary self. And it's one that's greeted with enormous hostility then and now, including, by the way, by visual artists who, by and large, if you would ask, would tend, if they're reading poetry, to read exactly the kind of poetry that they wouldn't be interested in art, which always seems odd to me, because within poetry, the conception of the subjective self-enclosed space is so significant, which is why poetry is so important. But I would say that is the gold standard, the referential representation of a single view, and that's what's being critiqued. I'm interested in the idea of projections, though, and you use the word projection, but a projection of personality. But I'm interested in projections in a more the sense of like a film projector, not as a film, but projections and overlaying of images. And actually, Melissa mentioned spectacle, so it relates to that. Thinking of the idea of theatricality versus absorption or immersive. I would say, and maybe you could comment on this in a second, that your work is immersive because it's multi-layered, but it goes against the current extremely fashionable idea of immersion, immersive spectacle, or which is a kind of Disney thing, but we see it at the Whitney Museum as well. You want immersion, but without that kind of a pseudo hologram effect. But still, there's a very powerful, by the refusal to have a resolution at any one level, there's a self-consciousness of the viewer viewing it. So, and that's why I like watching you look at it. This was in a way the definition of theatricality. It didn't allow complete absorption because you're aware of yourself looking. So these are paintings that are immersive, but remain theatrical and theatricalized through a set of overlaid projections. Also thinking of rear projection, like Hans Jürgen Seeberg, remember our Hitler, where there were back projections and then the figures are painted on top. So here's my image that that I have to share with you. I just made this up last night. I'm interested in this idea of the magic lantern and the way, and in fact, this image of seeing the audience, the projector, and the painting as a kind of overlay of a kind of ghastly or ghostly presence of images which flicker as being part of your work. So, I mean, I would say that those are a set of ways that I'm thinking about the work in terms of this allegory of form, and I wondered if you would be so kind as to comment on that.
Oh my God, it's so much. First of all, it's nice to hear somebody talk about that free essay whilst understanding it, because whatever, it's definitely been drugged through the mud for a long time. It's funny because Melissa and I talked about this the other day, that flicker is a kind of, I mean, it's something that I think I drew from synthetic, or I should say analytic cubism, thinking about a kind of all over pulsation and energy in a painting, but that I easily saw in Masaccio or in weavings. And it's what I think is what makes painting different from a lot of other things, in the sense that there needs to be a rhythmic pulsation behind these things, and behind these things that's penetrating. It's all about the penetration of context and passing through these bodies. And I mean that in a sexual way, and I mean that in a kind of psychological way too. And that these bodies are not, to a certain extent, resisting that, whatever it is, the rear screen or the front screen projection. And I think it really is actually both. And I think it's both because, again, it's just another way that they are not stable. They are in a state of kind of way finding, of searching, of becoming. And these forces are both causing that to be possible and also making that difficult, making that struggle rather than power.
Right. Well, I love the use of the word struggle in this respect, that the painting struggles and doesn't resolve. But three other words that I want to ask you about. I'm against the idea that you can distinguish figuration from abstraction. I suspect you are too, that you cannot, you see one thing as an abstraction, then it resolves into figuration. And the other issue would be 3D. The paintings seem to be 3D. That's why I showed the Magic Lantern as a proto 3D version. That's another history of film. So those two issues, the interconnection between figuration, abstraction, and 3D Magic Lantern, how do you think about those when you're painting as a, I mean, are you, or what do you think?
I mean, part of that is actually, I mean, one of the things I like that Delaney says about his work is that, oftentimes he'd write to get a hard on. I mean, to enjoy himself, to actually make what he wants to look at. And I like to look at this. I mean, like, I like to look at something that throbs with glistening light. But in terms of 3D, for sure, the connection to, I'm thinking of the connection to Disney and all that stuff, and how what are those boxes that they use to make Disney animations so in depth and dynamic, that are the layers? Somebody help me. Maybe nobody knows. It's the glass. They put the glass in the box, and it's actually 3D.
Yeah.
I don't know why I can't think of what that's called, but I sort of wanted that to be alluded to. Again, it's a kind of sense of natural depth, but that also just comes up and sort of slaps you in the face and says that you are here, like, now, like this is it. That's where I'm like an American. I come out of an American tradition of kind of a physical sort of flat-footed painting. But then I'm also kind of I also am drawn to this kind of European notion of storytelling and figuration. That aside, so there is that. I think it's that strange strike of the note somewhere between perverting naturalism, projecting naturalism, and then and sort of fraying it and penetrating it and taking it apart again. I can't do it without it. At least I haven't figured that out yet. But anyway, so that aside, this idea, and I wish that I could just conjure her up. I think like when Katie Siegel talks about like incommensurability and like the luxury of incommensurability, this is a notion that I think we've lost in a way, that somehow we wouldn't partition painting in this way, that it would be like, are you working abstractly or figuratively? That is the stupidest question that anyone could ever pose to me. It's like, what about that isn't abstract, and what about that isn't figuratively?
No.
Whether it is the trace of my body that's clearly moving that thing, and I don't want to overly romanticize or sentimentalize that. That's where rigor is needed. But also, like, what about that green blob next to her head describes something? It doesn't. And it describes something that can't be described, right? It describes force, not a named thing, and so, when she talks of, there's a great lecture that she did a while back that I saw, it was called The Luxury of Incommensurability. That luxury is based in the gold standard too, in the sense that it's all about like putting people in different teams and allowing for easy just articulation of marketing. I believe in the project of modernism and how important it was to find another way to speak about the world, and that is deeply dedicated to an investment with abstraction. And I also know that if I go ahead.
Well, I just want to
use figures,
I want you to
won't be
finish
able
that
to
thought.
tell the stories I want. Yeah. So I need them.
So I want to move to what is more directly figural to a conventional eye, right? And let's go back to the Jenna Rowlands in the back gallery and really talk about the faciality, and also what I think also, Warhol was doing and people often misunderstood, like with celebrity, that this kind of portraiture veers into abstraction, this hyperreality, right? But also simply the close-up on the face is also a way of exploring the landscape of the face and its context.
I'd also the program director in me also just wants to point out that we've got 3 questions in the Q&A. So
great. I got them.
That we might want to address at some point.
We're going to do that like after, we're going to tie up around 7:05. So we have just a few more minutes.
Sounds great.
Yep. We're going to end back here. It's a great room.
Nayland, it's just everything that you said about Jenna and and that, I mean, just thinking about the way that they produced those films, they were in their house with their kids and their mothers, and it was literally this like, it literally was the way that they lived their day, was to like, okay, you're back from school, we can shoot the scene with the kids. Now I'm gonna make dinner. Boom, boom. Here comes Ben and Peter. Like, all right, let's have a drink. We just, and they made up ways of recording audio so that, I'm thinking specifically of Woman Under the Influence, like so that the actors could move in ways that and you could still pick up ambient sound. And they basically did that like in their house. Like this is I mean, in a strange way, it is integrating in that thing that I feel like the Modernist Project tried to do so desperately, was to integrate life and art in a way. I feel like it almost, in American art, it culminates with for me in those 4 films in the 70s the Cassavetes made.
Well, and
so
those and those movies are on a continuum with early Warhol films as well. Not only the screen tests, but then a little bit later in Chelsea Girls and those kind of like turn the camera on and let it run.
There's another
movies.
There in Cassavetes, of course, you have improvisation, and there's an aspect to the paintings which feel improvised, and actually almost everything you've said have suggested that sense. In thinking about talking about Gina Rollins, Susan and I watched last night playback the Columbo episode that she's in, and that is exactly what Nayland has said in terms of the acting. It's extremely, for one thing, I mean, she's gaslighted, she's in a wheelchair, she almost can't move, and yet, and very slight expression in the face is what makes it so powerful. Very, very fleeting, all in lines of what you have said. So it's interesting to see, what when you think of Andy Warhol with Marilyn Monroe, what the iconicity of Gina Rollins is, and I think that's what you and Angie are discussing. Why, what we project in when we're seeing that image and what we know of her from the films.
Well, now I would love to see. Now I'd love to see Cassavetes direct Ondine.
Because I love that, because I was just going to say, because Gina Rollins is closer to a Warhol superstar than she is to a Marilyn Monroe, for example. Although Marilyn has those qualities too. She was just kind of fucked over by so many people. But can we flip around and look at the Rifleman?
But I want to. Okay. We're going to flip around and look at the Rifleman. But I want to actually interject here to say that there was incredible improvisation. For sure, but the films were very scripted. In fact, they were rigorous about the language that was delivered, and to a certain extent, like not the movements, but the language that was delivered through their bodies was very scripted, and they were super stringent about that, which I find really interesting, because it's this way. I mean, I find that really dynamic in the sense that there is this very specific thing that needs to happen, but all of these ways that it could come about, right? She is the greatest actor in the world, in the sense she could take language that was even potentially, and I'm kind of quoting my friend William E. Jones here, like she could take language from Cassavetes that was in or whatever, a series of actions, let's say, that were quite sentimental. Gloria is, speaking of utopic, it's absurd. I mean, it's almost ridiculously like heroic in a way that's, I mean, I love it for that, but
it's almost melodrama.
They're happy ending. There is this way that he almost loves his character too much, and she is a ruthless, unsentimental interrogator of the language, and she is able to interrogate and make love to language with her face all at once. And no other actress is able to be that raw and present. I mean, in this way that the line in Opening Night is well, I was so close to the skin when I was 18, blah, blah, blah. This is where I'm not that close now. I have all this experience. It's kind of, look back to this idea of laminated onto that raw emotional ecosystem. And it's like, okay, so now what do I do? Like, how do I act as a translator? And I guess I wanted to say that in relationship to the child, which Melissa brought up, that the child is in these is often very, very much that young. I mean, for me, it's very much that young, uncivilized, unsublimated gay self that culture is really trying to will into a very specific kind of discourse around gender. Right. So, and to a certain extent, like especially woman under the influence, she is not infantile, but she is if she could have been a feminist, she would have understood that she isn't infantile, and that her desires and that her need for communication and agency was not insanity. And the Delaney talks about that so beautifully too. I could go on and on and on and on, but you can't get that meaning from that film without this woman being able to do that much rigorous projection with her face. And to a certain extent, when I think about like great paintings, there's a million decisions that happen per second. Do I keep this thing, or do I, like, whatever it is, until you find this balance. And I just like, I feel like I inherited an emotional intelligence from watching her perform that speaks more to my life than pretty much almost anything. I mean, I can say that about certain Warhol films. That Hedy Lamarr film is pretty freaking amazing, but I could go on. So I just want to say that is why, to a certain extent, she's here and she's so important. And I find that she is a medium like painting in a funny way, and a rigorous one, not a sentimental one.
So I want to interject here. We have your good friend Kate Shepard just wrote, why don't we let's not have questions and just let them keep talking, but we have good questions. We have like a couple really good questions. I want to talk, and we can keep the discussion going. It doesn't just have to be Angela like answering.
Let me,
right?
I think we should definitely go to
Charles.
questions. Let me just show this one, because it's a radical
Yes.
juxtaposition, and I kind of like the
And you
idea
prepared it.
that it is a juxtaposition. But, well, this is a painting of Angie's called The Lost Fishing Village of Diderot, Boucher, and Lorraine, or the movie set of Pioneer Legacy 2009. And I want to juxtapose that with Thomas Cole's Voyage of Life, 1842 Manhood. And what I'm kind of interested in this question is, let's look at them both together, is this kind of space. So this of course, this is the ultimate. The Call and your painting speak to a lot of what you talked about today. It's a kind of space of longing, of fantasy, and of multiple layers. And they're visionary paintings, both of them. And this kind of space in the back interests me so much. And I just wanted to, because I think it's a beautiful place to end, and to think about it in terms of your very explicit critique of Enlightenment ideas of reason and perspective. Now, I know that's not in this show, but still, I think we could talk about your other work as we.
Oh no, I mean, I think it. I think it is. You can use perspective whilst not celebrating it. I hope. I hope we're still in a great place to do that. But in terms of reason, I mean, the slippery notion, the impossible. Well, I guess we could point at her would make a lot of sense, or the overlay here. But this witch character, which I kind of think about as Christ in reverse, right? I mean, she is hanging next to Jenna, and for a very important reason, is I think she is maybe the demonic form, but really she's also the one that is, to a certain extent, not burdened by whatever, though, that even the concept of Marilyn Monroe. I mean, this is an entity that does not base their agency on what are the kind of reasonable frameworks, ideologies of the heteronormative family, let's say. I mean, this is the way I think about this creature. And these crowded pictures, right? These are to a certain extent an explosion of the notion of a conventional family structure, which all of that came out of the domestication of women coming out of the period of Enlightenment. I feel like everybody knows that. And so the whole, like, that was also strangely the period when witches stopped being persecuted. The reason of the Enlightenment said, no, we're not going to just burn women for being practitioners, or for being like not financially viable, or not behaving of the doctrine of the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church. We're not going to do that anymore. We're just going to totally, capture them in a modern idea of the pure role of domestic serving of the family and of producing bodies for labor. I mean, I'm quoting Silvia Federici here. Sorry.
Yeah.
But there it is.
I don't know if this is an apocryphal Brecht quote or not, but it's always stayed with me, which is, what is killing a man compared to hiring a man?
So good.
Oh, well, we
Awesome.
should point to this. We should point back to the examination, because you know that was very much what I was thinking about, are some of those strikes, those labor strikes that happened throughout the 19th and 20th century, where it was like people stopped working. They sort of stopped the production. It became a kind of productive or to a sort of polymorphic non-productivity that became not in social media where you're just selling your pretty selfie to everybody, although I do enjoy looking at those sometimes, people, but that you're actually
send nudes.
Send the nudes. But that you're actually like using the architecture for something way more useful than producing a bunch of crap, basically, that ends up in Dollar General. So I don't know, Charles, your question was so hard. I don't know if I answered it, except to say the critique is most definitely here. And I think it's there in form, and I think it's there in the way the narratives the layers of the narratives that are at least going on in my head, that I hope.
Thomas Cole made that painting at the time that Edgar Allan Poe was making his phantasmagoric works, and there's a way in which, and of course based on the landscape that from the Hudson Valley, there's a way in which that visionary space is an open and it's an imaginary space. It's a fantasy space, and that you have such an explicit sense of that multiple space that can connect up to the voyage of life by call just strikes me as extraordinary.
And it's quite absurd, of course, because Cole to me is the epitome of a reactionary.
But I think that, to me, the only way we get to a queer utopia is through somebody mapping it in advance. And I think that's a big part of what the project is here, is sort of a summoning of that into being through the paintings.
Well, of course, I mean, that painting is called Manhood. Everything about what you said is the opposite.
It's so weird.
But that's why it's interesting to see in respect to your painting.
Exactly. I mean, you totally get it 100%, Charles. It's exactly spot on. And I had a conversation with someone about this, relating it to the film L'Argent by Robert Bresson, Rob Colvin, who will be a video of that soon. He's awesome. And anyway, and I was saying that like in L'Argent, there's that one counterfeit dollar. It's based on the Tolstoy story of the forged coupon, but where the one forged dollar gets sort of distributed around, and as people become implicated, well, there's many, but anyway, one guy gets implemented. He's insanely hot. Nayland, have you seen that movie? Ooh. Anyway, and he's wearing those suspenders, which I wish I was wearing right now. But anyway, you're not supposed to shop in a Bresson movie, but the problem is he's so utterly rigorously exquisite in framing things that you're like, oh my God, I didn't know phones were so beautiful in the 80s. But anyways, so he basically gets implicated in this thing and ends up basically, getting, he ends up being incarcerated. He ends up attempting suicide. He ends up becoming a family murderer. He murders entire families because, as Foucault's ideas of being imprisoned creates the criminal, and to a certain extent creates the sociopath, I guess you could say. I'm being way too brief in that summation, but I think you all know what I mean. And so Bresson makes this extreme example that through these processes of a kind of desperate capitalism where everyone is sort of living just above the threshold of instability, let's say, and that's of course a white example. I don't think I even need to say that, but just in case, because everybody else is below that threshold. Not everybody, but you know what I mean. That they become implicated into criminality. It's like a wonderful 1980s noir film noir, and he ends up in prison. Then he ends up becoming a psychotic murderer. And what I was saying about this painting is that this is the antithesis to that, even though I absolutely love that film, in the sense that I'm not telling the story of the decimation of an individual. I'm saying let's dissimulate the individual and find a social space in which we can do something else, even though there is still shit tons of anxiety and unmet desires and anxieties, and I already said that, but neuroses at play here. They're never going to go anywhere. At least to a certain extent, it's not that, right? So this is my way of thinking about a film like that, and thinking about like all of those different scenes and all of those characters and this object that sort of passes through the thread of the story. Also, the chromaticness is almost identical to this in the sense it's a tessellation between siennas and blues. And it's like he used the color in that painting like Borman did in Point Blank or something, where it's just like, it's really abstract. It's not three-dimensional. It's kind of flattened in this way for concision. Anyway, and I was thinking about that as the dual chromatic in this as like a way of kind of like simplifying. And so
Okay.
this is the antithesis of that, and I'll stop.
Okay, good,
Sorry.
because I really think I'd love to get to questions. It's been such a fantastic discussion. And one that relates to one issue that we brought up is Heather Michaud asks about how you're thinking about the way you use text in your work. Like if we swing over to the Jenna Rollins, the rifleman with the big cowboy hat. Good. There's a couple language references. Can we go in and want to talk a little bit about that? What's the relationship of text also in a larger sense, not just these particular, right? And she says, beautiful work, so drawn to your creation of depth and space. Kiss the cunt of God.
Well, that's a line from I almost blame you for this, Melissa. There's a recording of Conrad playing with Angus MacLeese. And they're
Tony
doing
Conrad,
kind of
like, you got cut out. Tony Conrad, she's referring to.
Tony Conrad, yeah. And there's Conrad's playing, I think, the violin, and MacLeese is like banging on something, and he just starts ranting about. Again, it's very much like a sort of rant against. I mean, so it was Reagan era, I think. No, when did Angus MacLeese die? It was like it was mid-70s. No, it had to have been early 70s, if not late 60s. So maybe it was a Nixon hating song. I don't know. But whatever it was, it's a rant against murderous men in power. And at a certain point, Tony Conrad it has just completely called them every horrible name on the face of the earth. I think it's probably also like a Vietnam War protest song. And he says, I hope, like, he's basically like, I hope you disappear into a pile of the deepest, most molten, meaningless shit. Kiss the cunt of God. And it's not that the cunt of God is shit, but it's the idea, that inversion that God would be, would have a cunt gets me really excited, because it is just that, like, I mean, at its fundamental level, it's anti, like, every Western patriarchal structure, but and Jenna is that for me. So
and interrelated here is because I'm trying to relate questions to each other, even though I know there's an order. But Jeffrey Chadsey, your
my
wonderful
husband.
playmate, gay husband. Oh God, I hate using those terms, but I know you guys use those terms. But he said, do you look at language and references in your work? Do you want your audience to revel and know those, or expect to know those, or do you also kind of use it as a playlist that you pass on to them? Recommended reading, twisting texts, kind of nice.
I
We need to put these away. These are
Okay.
going out.
Oh, they are. Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Sorry, we're switching to headphones. I don't really.
That's bad. That's not good quality.
This is again one of those.
That quality is not good. The sound is not good.
No. I know. Hold on. We're gonna put these back on. It's gonna be okay.
Yeah. Because we only have, we're going only till 7:30. It's 7:17.
Sorry.
So let's stay
We
tight.
haven't had any tech problems at this point.
Let's try to touch as many questions
they usually
as possible.
are. Whatever. It's always that thing. I mean, there's so many references in these things that there would be no way I would ever expect that. And to a certain extent, that I'm talking about the motivations, and I feel like I need to be front loaded with so much referentiality, because I use these things to evolve as a person. And so that if I feel as though I'm evolving in my knowledge, and in terms of, like, the way that I can conceive of the world, or engineer the world, or architect the world, whatever it is, then I can sustain myself through one of these paintings. And if I don't have that, I literally feel like I'm producing something just like anything else, if that makes sense. So I need that. So for me, it's a playlist, definitely.
That's great and related. Emily Sunderman's question. Can we move into that? Because it's related.
Yep.
Yeah. She has a beautiful, beautiful question. She said, you speak
She's
about
a beautiful
flickering.
person.
Right on. You speak about flickering, pulsing, energetic, glimmery, glistening light through, and wondered if you listen to music when you paint. And if so, could you talk a little bit about the music you listen to when you paint? I love you, your paintings, and this talk. Thanks, Emily. Go, Angie.
Yeah.
Music and sound.
I wish I could be listening to Emily playing the violin sometime. Like, wonder what that would be. Emily's an amazing musician and a teacher of music, and I would love to listen, maybe make a painting where she just played the violin the whole time. Absolutely. I mean, it's there are some paintings that I've listened to a single song almost the whole entire time through. There's in particular that No Longer the Hazardous Forest painting. I listened to Stevie Nicks. It's on the Tusk album. I mean, Stevie. Do I even need to say anything else? But that song. Oh God, what the hell is it called? It's the every night that goes between. I feel a little less. Storms. The song is called Storms, and I just couldn't stop listening to it. It was something about the chord progression. There's something about the melancholicness. There was something about the just the like frayedness of her voice that literally I could have listened to for forever. I mean, I play it on the guitar, which is unfortunate for anybody who's witnessed it. And so that's a pop song example. I listen to a lot of Sonny Chirac I wonder if Charles knows Sonny Chirac or anybody. This incredible guitar player who
Sure.
just like Sonic
Guitarist.
Youth was really into, and his wife Linda. They do a version of the bolero that has this undulating layers of melodic texture and rhythmic like feel like a weft of rhythmic patterning that is so dynamic that it literally makes my head explode, like in the way that it makes things seem possible that aren't possible. And there's tons of music that do that, musics that do that to me, but those off the head come to me. Stevie Nicks is really great at doing that same thing, of having a kind of sound that is almost like this smoky force that traverses over the rhythmic section and the kind of melodic structure. And so I use those things as hypnosis, I think, and to uncivilize myself. But I also listen to books a lot now, which is weird. It actually works because thoughts and text can do that to me now too. What do you want me to do?
Very cool. Yeah. Can you talk about color? Several questions about color and how you think about color. And I'm racing through these trying to see one that then Charlie Ehrenfried is one who we love so much. And you know well. So relationship also to the Italian Baroque also. And the like she's turned, like you've turned the lights up way up on Caravaggio, and suddenly there's a big gay color. For me, it makes me consider that these queer bodies interactions have been in that history of painting the whole time. So color, queerness, form, all of that. Can you give us a few bites at that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess so. That's amazing. And yes, and yes. And to a certain extent, it's also, I don't want to overly romanticize intuition, but to a certain extent, maybe it's capricious or like a kind of like, oh, that's the flavor I want today. I'm going to start with that. But it's a weird thing to say, but it's kind of true. With a painting like this, or maybe more specifically with Golden Showers, I actually started this painting, and I thought, and I did it with all, especially the large figurative ones, the large crowds. I started it out with striations of actual colors that across the kind of 4 laws of coloration are opposing. So they're kind of, except in value, they're similar registration of value. So where it's like they have a hue, a position of hue that's oppositional to the other color, and they have a temperature of opposition, and they have to a certain extent that kind of primary right, it's whatever, it's like hue, temperature, and I don't know why I'm getting tired, but that are opposing, and I basically create an abstract field with these counterforces, these chromatic counterforces that actually create this kind of gray field that atmospherically turns into a really open gray ground in the way that like someone like Gilbert would use to kind of grisaille over, so that I've created a kind of binary battle that is self-canceling, and then I want to decimate the binary with the overlaying of all the other stuff that ends up being introduced into the painting.
That's
right.
Excellent.
So I'm
Boom.
creating a binary and breaking it, and actually creating a lace work of these socialities. So I'm really thinking very specifically about that.
It's a beautiful answer. There's also a question about photography, and said it's probably no mistake that you're showing in a gallery that primarily uses a lot of photography, and you've talked a lot about film, but could you talk more about the still image? And that's coming from Steve Giovinco, or Vinco. I hope I'm saying the name right.
Well, cool. I mean, I can't comment on because I feel like it's too important, like whatever the history of this gallery and its relationship to photography, except to say that it's humbling and excellent. But as a painter, I'm very particular about my relationship to photography. Like all of these large paintings have like no photo references to them. Not the heads, but the crowds. I mean, I'm really not. I'm not interested. I love these artists like Sylvia Mangold, or I mean, I don't ever need to see another Chuck Close painting again. But who does? But you know, or like the project of Toylman, or to a certain extent, even yeah. Anyway, I'm not like interested in paintings relationship to photography too much. I am definitely interested in mediation. But in terms of like a kind of translation of the photograph, I'm only interested in the source of the photograph as a mediated as a space of mediation, or a space of meaning to interact with. And so all these Jenna Rollins photos, the photos that I used to base these paintings on, were photos that were sent to me by Dawn Clements, photos that she actually took of her television and sent to me because she knows that I'm obsessed with Jenna. And she took hundreds of them and captured all of these macro expressions, just like she was probably sitting at her table drawing, and actually maybe even sometimes writing down the dialogue and stuff, which is a process of like, maybe I was listening to that Tony Conrad song and decided to paint in that because I was listening to that song. That could have been possible, the Kiss the Cunt of God line. So I'm interested in the community of how this photograph got to me, not necessarily that it's a photographic reference, even though I know that's important. I think it's infused with the kind of energy that maybe is different than those who are in some interrogative and analytic critical relationship.
That's great. And I think we should end on one last question. But someone beautifully suggested that we make a playlist of all the references mentioned in the talk, from Nayland, from Charles, from myself, from you, and we put them up. And we'll do that. That's such a great idea. I love it so much. And Carol Zoft asked this question. It's a big question. It's kind of a cool, open-ended, wild question to end on. She said, you talk a bit about a critique in your work of innocence, in terms of how its claim to societal value has risen and fallen throughout history. Woo! We can leave this open-ended too, but it's huge.
I mean, I don't, it's weird. I think that definition of innocence only exists so that, you know, we can torture young people into turning them into what they want. Nobody's innocent. I mean, I know that's for sure. That would be a swipe. I don't know, Nayland, you giggled. What did you think of that question?
Well, I giggled about the can you talk a bit part of it. Like, can anyone talk a bit about that topic? That's a pretty big bit.
Yeah, it's a really, really big bit. But thank you, Carol, for that. I'm not, but I would say we would probably not be doing it justice, except to say that I don't believe in innocence, and that would be just that would. So I don't even know how I would critique it. To a certain extent, maybe that's, you know, maybe it's at play.
I mean, maybe actually, as a way of kind of wrapping it up, it's innocence is a discourse, non pari, right? It is a way of naming things, as a purely as a figure of alarm or nostalgia, or that bears little resemblance to what it doesn't describe anything. It just corrals things.
Yeah, that is so perfect, because it really does go back to the Delaney.
Where we started. Are these children innocent here?
Is that car innocent?
Hell no.
Whoa,
oh, Nayland,
that's really
so
good. Boom, really good. The people's car.
It says it's a
Excellent.
hybrid, so it must be innocent.
I'm
I
all
think
about hybridity.
Yeah.
Angela, I also have to just quickly thank you for using the term
Yeah.
gaseous.
I did it for you, baby.
That given that my Twitter profile says gender gaseous these days.
So great.
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing that on your Instagram feed, and I think it actually years back. I mean, it must have been 3 or 4 years back, and thinking, oh, that's why I'm so into ephemerality and penetration and transparency.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Nayland, yet again.
We will condense together.
I hope so.
Beautiful. Unless Charles has one last statement, I think we should try to shut this down. And Charles, do you want to say one little? You good? Yeah. And Angie, so I just want to thank everyone. Nayland Blake and Charles Bernstein, can't thank you enough for joining us. I know it means so much to Angie that you were part of this discussion, and I hope it continues into the future.
Charles,
A pleasure.
Charles,
Great
I can't
pleasure.
wait to spend
Yeah.
so much more time on those conversations around the Enlightenment. I'd be
Yeah.
so honored.
We will
Yeah,
continue.
and-
Yeah, wonderful
Yes,
to be
and-
with you, and great program. Thank you, Melissa, for organizing this
Mhm.
and asking
My
to have
pleasure.
you part of it.
That's my job, is to thank my dear friend Melissa Ragona for being a beast and bringing everybody together and just being a genius and fearless and
corralling these wild, wonderful minds. Amazing.
endlessly
I love
endlessly
this. I was so excited to
bountiful.
bring you together. Yeah,
Thank you.
I couldn't wait to see this. It was so good. And of course, Yossi Milo, like big kudos to Yossi Milo. What a fantastic exhibition. What a beautiful installation of it, and to the whole team, the technology, everything. Yeah, thank you. And there we go, Matthew Degnan.
Matthew,
really great.
I didn't ask him
Really
to do
important.
that. He's like, get me off
And-
that thing.
And thank you,
He's
audience for joining us and for hanging in there, and your fabulous questions. I hope that I condensed some of them and got to almost every single question. I know I didn't, but I tried. Okay, let's
Thank you.
just say thank you and good night.